Let me start recording. All right, how's everybody's first week going? Is it everything you dreamed of and more?
Definitely, and more.
A nightmare.
I definitely second the and more.
I like the positively delightful. Hopefully, you found a way or starting to get in kind of a groove of making the course work around your schedule, because that's part of what this is about, is getting in good knowledge, but also making it where it can kind of work with your life and what else you have going on, families, jobs, dot, dot, dot. So the format of these weekly meetings, a lot of you guys dropped questions that you had. Some just added in like things they found interesting or liked reading about. I enjoyed reading all of those. Please go look at the discussion board, interact with your classmates. It just kind of keeps this from being a total solo project. For the people who answered questions, I'm going to go through, look at them, talk about them. There were a lot of really good ones. So we'll kind of clip through a lot of these. If you have questions as we are going through them, please, please, please feel free to add in stuff. This is about your educational journey and kind of taking the most of it and getting the most information you can. So the first question that was there was from Mr. McLean, and it was about positive and negative feedback loops, maintaining homeostasis, specifically during exercise and recovery. And I really like this one, and a lot of people ask about homeostasis, so we'll do a couple different, like a series of homeostasis questions today. For this one, yes, your body is very much going through homeostatic measures during exercise and recovery. And from the reading you guys did and the lectures you watched, what is more common in the body, a positive or a negative feedback loop? By and large, the body is mostly negative feedback loops. There are very few positive feedback loops within the body. And let's see, who was it? Kenny asked about like positive and negative feedback loops and if that was correlating to an outcome. No, not correlating to an outcome. So the way when you think about positive and negative feedback loops is the process that is ongoing in the body. If the feedback loop enhances, continues, strengthens that particular process. So it doesn't stop it. It keeps it going in the forward motion that that process is currently heading towards. That is a positive feedback loop. It is adding to that. So think about addition as a plus sign, positive feedback loops, it is adding to it. A female in labor, their body sensing those contractions, sensing the labor, and then releases oxytocin to continue to increase contractions and aid to that labor. It is not stopping the contractions, it is increasing them, it is adding to them. That is a positive feedback loop. Negative feedback loops are going to subtract or stop or reverse the processes that are going on. So negative minus, it's taking away from it. For the body, for exercise, your feedback loops that it's engaging in are by and large going to be your negative feedback loops. So just to run through a couple of them. When you're exercising and when you're going through recovery, you do need a lot of ATP, and that's your energy source. You will hear talks about ATP, ATP, ATP all throughout this class and all through paramedic school because it's incredibly important. That is the energy in your body. In order to have that energy, though, the body has to make it. So we go through certain types of metabolism. So there's cellular metabolism, the Krebs cycle will all become fun stuff for you at some point. But the body needs to engage certain resources, your food, the glucose, the fats, the proteins that you take in order to produce that ATP. As you use the ATP and it's noticing a depletion, the body isn't going to further deplete it. It is going to do a reverse process and start to try to increase the amount of ATP that you have there by asking the liver to release the glycogen that it's storing, by releasing fats, releasing proteins if you don't have enough glycogen so that you can have that food source there to increase ATP. While we're on the talk of ATP, you also need a lot of oxygen in order to make that energy source. So as you burn through it, your respirations are going to increase. Your heart rate is going to increase. This is all in an effort to get oxygen to the cellular levels so that you have an oxygen rich and aerobic environment so that you're able to produce lots of ATP. The other big one that kind of just immediately jumped to my mind is temperature. As you exercise, for those of you who do exercise, you get really hot, right? You get hot, which causes you to do what as you get hotter? You're going to sweat. Sweating is a homeostatic measure so that your body can cool itself down by convection. So as you sweat and that water reaches up to your skin, it allows the wind that's blowing by it to help cool the skin, which then helps cool down your internal temperature. That heat is a direct byproduct of ATP production. So as we're making that energy source, we not only get the good, we get the bad as well. So heat's a big one. Certain acids, if you don't have enough oxygen, so like lactic acid, for those of you who've gotten that like deep muscle burn when you're exercising, that is due to your body trying to produce that ATP. Let's see, run through other questions about that particular like homeostasis during exercise while I look at other homeostasis related questions. Jacob asked about chapter 1 states that aging causes homeostatic imbalance. It does. Does that mean that geriatrics are never truly in homeostasis? Kind of yes and no. And this ties in with a couple other people asked about homeostasis and homeostatic imbalances whenever you're going through things like cancer or you have other long-term disease processes like COPD. And the body adjusts to try to have a new homeostatic measure. But essentially, yeah, older people kind of are always in a state of homeostatic imbalance. That's why they take certain medications or we see disease processes that start to manifest, and we have to adjust our care to account for that. The body is naturally going to adjust some things to maintain at least a new level of homeostasis, and COPD is kind of a big example of that one. So naturally, your respiratory drive is based off of your carbon dioxide or your oxygen. Tell me, from EMT school. What determines your ventilatory rate? How often you're ventilating yourself? Yeah, the amount of CO2. So those lovely chemoreceptors within your blood are picking up on the amount of, or within your vasculature, are picking up on the amount of carbon dioxide that is within your blood circulating through the body. And as you have raises or lowering of your circulating carbon dioxide, your respiratory rate will adjust to accommodate. So it'll speed up if you need to off-gas more CO2. It'll slow down if you need to keep in more CO2. It really adjusts nicely to that. People who have disease processes like COPD do something called air trapping. So with that chronic obstruction, they're not able to fully exhale all of the carbon dioxide that's within the alveoli because of the swelling. So some of that air is kept trapped. So they are going to have naturally higher amounts of carbon dioxide really all the time within their blood. Because of this, the body needs to adjust. It can't always keep up that increased ventilation because it's now a prolonged disease process. This is where we see people with COPD having a hypoxic drive. So instead of basing their ventilatory rate for their body off of their carbon dioxide level, they will also really start to rely on dips in SpO2. And they'll have a naturally lower SpO2 because of that. Because the body has shifted its homeostatic measures of how it is maintaining that ventilatory rate so that it can have appropriate amounts of oxygen within the body, which again is all about ATP production, believe it or not. Keeping that oxygen-rich environment so you can have lots of good energy source to run really everything within the body. Bill also had a question about homeostasis, so asking with like organ transplants, whenever their recipients refuse them, so you have a rejection of the organ transplant, is that a homeostatic imbalance? No. That is actually homeostasis at play, kind of. So that organ coming into your body is foreign, and your body does a really good job so that it can maintain its perfect balances with inside itself to try to recognize what is self and what is a foreign invader. And typically we really like when our body does this. So think you've been exposed to a virus, you've been exposed to a bacteria, some type of fungus. You have had something from the outside breach all of your defenses, make it in. You want your body to realize that is not me, so that your immune system will kick in. It'll identify that. Your killer T cells will start to attack it. Macrophages will eat it. You'll replicate it so that you can recognize it and start building future immune responses to that particular thing. The problem is when the foreign invader is something that we want or we put into our body purposefully. Organ transplant is a big one. So whenever somebody gets that organ, even if they do a good due diligence, right? So they type and cross you, they make sure that it's a perfect match. There's really no such thing as a truly perfect match unless it's coming from you. Anything that was not made by your body is going to be recognized as foreign. So whenever somebody receives that organ, even though they are purposely putting it in their body and their body needs it, their immune system still recognizes it as foreign, as other. And so the immune system does what the immune system is supposed to do to maintain homeostasis, and it'll begin to attack that organ. That is why people who get organ transplants or have had lots of major surgery where they've had things that aren't self. So think like pig valves for heart surgeries and things along those lines. They will be put on immunosuppressants frequently, and it is so that that homeostatic measure doesn't kick in, so that their body doesn't begin to attack that new organ and reject it. And honestly, those immunosuppressants don't always work. You can still have organ rejection even with immunosuppressants on board. Questions about homeostasis, positive feedback loops, all of that sort of fun stuff. Oh, there was one more. Noah asked about homeostasis and different areas that you could live around the world and how that might affect your homeostasis. Homeostasis is going to remain the same no matter geographically where you're living. Obviously, we know whenever we go somewhere else, so you live here in the South, you are adapted to very hot environments. You go visit Canada this time of year, you're probably going to be in a little bit of shock, right? It's a much colder environment. It's not what your body's used to. Regardless, homeostasis is going to operate and maintain the same. You're still going to have those same homeostatic measures. What we see geographically that happens far more often isn't necessarily a change in homeostasis. It's a mutation within the body itself to adjust to the environment. So think people who live closer to the equator tend to have more melanin in their skin. This helps with things like skin cancer and other skin breakdowns. Higher amounts of melanin are going to help with that. Versus people with lighter skin, we burn really easily. Further from the equator, indigenously, is where you'll see lighter skin colors coming from. Also think about areas in Africa where sickle cell was a genetic mutation. The reason we see sickle cell with those particular gene groups, those ethnicities, is because that was a natural mutation of the body to maintain homeostasis in an area where malaria was very prevalent. Malaria does not operate in the body that has sickle cell to the point that it's going to be an issue for them. So it's not that homeostasis changes geographically, it's that the body will begin to mutate to better adjust or have longer successful outcomes in those areas to maintain homeostasis. Does that make sense? Cool. I lied. There's one more homeostasis question. So Mr. Harrell, you were looking at homeostasis and you asked about autoregulation or intrinsic versus extrinsic regulations. And if whenever you have somebody that has an extrinsic, will it negate the intrinsic regulation effect that's going on? So let's look at both of those real quick. So intrinsic control or intrinsic regulation is whenever the organ itself maintains homeostasis. For instance, the heart can maintain its own heart rate. When we get to that chapter, we're going to talk all about the different cells that are within the heart and how it maintains its own heartbeat. And so, even without neurological control, so without control from the nervous system, the heart will always maintain its own heartbeat. That is a unique property of cardiac cells themselves, is that if those pacemaker cells don't say fire to propagate a response, the heart itself can do that. So that's going to be your intrinsic control. Extrinsic control, sorry about that. Extrinsic control is going to be whenever you have an outside factor, such as your nervous system or your endocrine system. So another organ, another place within your body is telling certain organs to do their things. And that's a fast versus slow. So nervous system is going to be very fast control. Endocrine is going to be slower, but longer maintained. So if the heart doesn't tell itself to increase its speed, the nervous system can come in and can say, hey, do your job. I want you to start beating. And from a nervous system standpoint, can increase or decrease the heart rate. The answer is kind of a yes and not quite, where it's not necessarily that extrinsic factors are going to negate intrinsic factors, but where the extrinsic factors kick in are because the intrinsic mechanisms have failed to operate. So if the nervous system is coming in and telling the heart to beat quicker, it's because the heart didn't naturally do that on its own. Or the heart isn't beating as it should. So the nervous system is going to try to come in and correct that. And the same with the endocrine. So your nervous system is only going to increase your heart rate for a certain amount of time. Eventually, the hormones from your endocrine system, like epinephrine, will make it to the heart and will continue to prolong that increased heart rate. So it's not that they negate each other, it's that they work together and they aid each other. So they're going for the same mission, which is to maintain what? They're not going to maintain homeostasis in opposite ways or not the same way. So it's not going to be like one is saying the heart rate needs to slow down to maintain homeostasis and the other is trying to increase the heart rate to maintain homeostasis. If your heart rate needs to increase because you're working out, because you have a kid who's screaming at you and you're getting nervous, whatever it may be, whatever your body is causing to increase your heart rate, it needs to increase regardless of who's the one driving the ship, who's the one that's causing that to happen. I believe those are all the questions about homeostasis. There was a comment, I think it was Abigail, about video 2.1 and one of the questions in there. For those of you who did not see that, did not see the email that I sent out, the question that was a true false that was asking if your atomic weight and your atomic number are the same thing. They are not. They are not at all. That was an error in the testing bank and like what it was marking as right or wrong. Those two are not the same thing. So what's the difference between your atomic weight and your atomic number? Yep, so weight or number is the number of protons. And then weight is your protons plus your neutrons. So it's really the mass. And I hate that it's listed as atomic weight because weight is subjective to the gravity, to the planet that you're on, the amount of gravitational force pulling on you. It really is the mass. But it's your protons and your neutrons. So they cannot be the same thing. Those are two very different numbers. So I'm so sorry for those of you when you were watching that particular video and you got to that question, it told you were wrong when you said false. And you either, one, knew you were right and stuck to your guns, or two, questioned what you knew. That is my slash Canvas is bad. That was not the correct answer. Thank you for those of you who pointed that out. Speaking of our chapter 2 videos, Shelby, you asked about molarity versus motility. Said slightly confused on the difference of the two and how to remember them. And again, this is where we're gonna look at differences. I'm so sorry about him. Differences in what it's actually measuring and looking at. And for this one, I have pictures. So your molarity of something, and what we're talking about is where we've dissolved a solvent in a solution. So you have made, why is that not going away? You have made salt water. You've got your solvent, salt, in your solution, the water. The molarity is the amount of the solute in the solution. So this, and remember that for a second. The solute in your solution. So what we're looking at is the liters, the volume of the fluid. So I dissolved 5 grains of salt in 1 liter of water. That is my molarity, the volume of the solution. Your molility is the moles of the solute, so still looking, pardon me, at those 5 grains of salt, but it's looking at the overall weight. So my kilograms of my solvent, the weight of it. Most certain circumstances, certain ways that you're looking at this, it's not really going to change the numbers too much. However, temperature is a good example of where these start to become glaringly different. So cold days versus warm days. Your molarity will change because I've still only put those 5 moles or those 5 salt crystals in 1 liter of water. So on a cold day, I have a molarity of 5 because I have 5 in that 1 liter. If it is a warm day and my water starts to expand because of the heat, it is going to then change the liter amount, even if it's just a little bit. It changes the overall volume of the fluid there, which will change my molarity. I haven't changed the amount of salt that's in it. What I have changed, though, is the overall volume of the fluid. As opposed to this, the weight of it doesn't really change. So cold day, warm day, those conditions that shift, the amount that I've put in, my 5 moles, doesn't change with the amount of the solvent that's there. Even if the water expands because of the heat, the weight of it won't change. So it still stays that I've used a kilogram. So volume versus a weight. Is Shelby on today? She is not. But does anybody else have a question about the two of those, how they're different? Jacob, you are an expert in this. So if you have anything else you'd like to add, please, my dear, by all means, do. Not to call you out.
Yeah, I'm a guy, but I do this I've done this a long time. Yeah, molarity is very convenient because you actually can end up doing it in your head a lot if you actually make a lot of solutions. But the cost of that convenience is, as Megan described, is the fact that that it is not temperature invariant in the way molality is. So typically, when you teach a student something like molality, you teach it to them in the context of something like a colligative property or some sort of property of a solution as it changes with temperature. And that's super inconvenient to consider something that varies with temperature. So you want a temperature invariant measurement. But generally, I can't speak for how it is in medicine. Generally, in most laboratories and most settings, most people are just going to use molarity and just assume that, oh, we have everything in a temperature controlled environment, so it's all good. But yeah, molality can be very useful. because of its temperature and variance. But it's a little bit more annoying to do in your head, for what that's worth.
Thank you. And speaking of medicine, we really do look at molarity more. So, areas where once we hit med math, it's concentrations all day long. But something that you guys are used to seeing now are like the fluids that are on your trucks. So, normal, quote unquote, normal saline is a 0.9 solution of sodium. Sorry, of sodium chloride. We carry those in different bag sizes. And when we talk about the bag sizes, what we're talking about is going to be the overall volume of fluid. So we're looking at this volume. And those will change based on the condition that it's in, but we don't necessarily appreciate that. We still just say how much fluid we're giving. Regardless of the temperature and the state that you're kind of in. But we're normally looking at the molarity of it. So that 0.9% solution is the molarity of your normal saline. Claire! Sorry, I just scared the crap out of Ziggy. Not to call you out. It can be confusing keeping all of those in mind. And remember, like, medicine is the world of mnemonics. And looking at different memory aids. If you guys come across memory aids that really help you in your studying, that you would like to share with your classmates, feel free to drop them in the discussion. I can also make like a separate discussion area so that it doesn't get jumbled with this one. That is just like fun study things that you have found. If that's not a route you guys would like to go, shoot them my way and I can embed them into the classroom itself. If I find things, I will send them out to you as well. I think, again, like I said it in orientation, I've said it earlier today, I think that education is a communal thing. I think all of us learn together. And so you guys sharing the resources that you find in your educational pursuit is important because we all end up better for it. And that kind of ties in with Nicholas's question. So you were looking at the abdominal regions versus the abdominal quadrants, which in EMT school, you guys were all taught the quadrants, right? So right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, left lower, right lower, and the organs that are lying there within. So Nicholas wanted to know, looking at the regions, and are those used in actual EMS calls? The question is, how in depth do you want to be? So you will very much determine the type of provider that you would like to be. And there's nothing wrong with you using the quadrants. And honestly, everybody's going to know the quadrants and what they're talking about. Where knowing the regions can be helpful for you as a provider is it just makes you a more detailed clinician. So instead of just feeling 4 areas of the abdomen, and those being decently large areas depending upon the person, and hold a number of organs within them, so it can make it a little bit harder to pinpoint what may be going on. If you, instead of palpating 4 quadrants, and you palpate 9 regions, you have now lessened the amount of organs that are within each area you're palpating, which can give you a better idea of what's going on. Now, some of you are thinking, why do I really care? Because, for the most part, especially with abdominal complaints, even at the medic level, it is a lot of symptomology management. So even if we have a good idea of what's going on, we're just managing their symptoms. They're nauseous, we give them Zofran. They're in pain, we give them some type of analgesic. We help reposition them. We give them fluids if they're dehydrated. If they've been vomiting all day, they're probably dehydrated, so we can give them some fluids. So why do I need to know what's going on? It just makes you a better clinician. It gives you a better idea, and it can help you figure out a better place for them to go. So if they have abdominal pain and they're like, I just want to go right down the road to Brighton Park, for those of you who aren't local, that's a freestanding ED. And that might not be a bad choice, but if what you're suspecting could be something that needs to have surgery, and you found that based on your assessment, then taking them to a freestanding ED really isn't going to be great for them. They need to go to somewhere that could have the surgical capabilities. So it could adjust or augment your treatment or transport of the patient. So kind of in a long answer to a simple question. Do you need to use the regions? No, you can stick with quadrants if you'd like. It just gives you a more detailed view of what's going on. I love what's going on right now in the chat, by the way. Dylan, Mr. Williams, you had a question about hydrogen bonds. And is that a bond that only includes fluorine, nitrogen, or oxygen, or is there kind of more to it? This is a simple question for something that's not. It can be simple, but it's also not so simple. Again, Jacob, feel free to jump in whenever you'd like, if you'd like. So, a hydrogen bond is a bond that is between something that is a very strong electronegative. So, it's got an almost full outer ring. And a hydrogen atom, which we know has how many electrons? How many electrons do you have on that hydrogen atom? One. I've got one electron on my hydrogen atom, which means the things that it's bonding with have to have or are going to have an almost full outer ring. So we're looking at things that are very strong electronegative, and the hydrogen is bonding to them. So while that is oxygen, fluorine, nitrogen, there are other things that it can, pardon me, chlorine. There are other things that the hydrogen will bond to. It's just a hydrogen bond is going to be one that's between a very strong electronegative atom and then a hydrogen atom. We see these obviously in water, H2O. You'll see hydrogen bonds in your DNA. You'll see hydrogen bonds in certain proteins. So it's not necessarily that it's linked to those atoms in particular. A hydrogen bond is a bond between a strong electronegative atom or force, so something that's got an almost full ring, and a hydrogen atom. I live in a just funny farm. I'm so sorry all my animals are freaking out now. Um,
Yeah, the only thing I'm sorry, Megan.
no, add on.
Yeah, the only thing to add, like with a hydrogen bond, just to help you think about it, because I think I did notice that comment, is like, you got to think of what hydrogen really is. It's just a proton. It's just one little proton, and he's got his one little electron, and he basically gets beat up and his lunch money taken by everybody because he's the wimpiest little dude on the block, right? He's the very first element in the thing. He doesn't really have enough power to hold on to that electron very well. So it's very easy for, as you described in your lecture, for polar bonds to form with hydrogen because it's an unequal sharing of the electrons. We say a covalent bond is, they share the electrons, but it doesn't necessarily do it evenly. So it's very easy to really pull that electron far away. And then as described in the lecture, you have that induced dipole where you have more of the negative on one end, and then you have that remaining positive on the other end. So then the hydrogen bonding occurs because suddenly you have a bunch of, in the case of water, which is like the one we always consider, you have the oxygens floating around with a bunch of extra negative, and you have these basically bare positively charged protons hanging out on the ends and then it complexes together because the positive protons are attracted to those negative poles on the oxygen, and it like I said, it forms what we call hydrogen bonding, a tendency to stick together, and which is where we see the water's cohesion come from, and the fact that it's a liquid at room temperature when it really shouldn't be, and everything like that.
Thank you. I like having you here. My background, biology. So I have chemistry. Not a chemist. So having you here to help with some of these is chef's kiss. Fantastic. Two of the other big questions that came up, one was from Mr. Dusenberry and the other one was from Jonathan, were about acid-base, kind of acidosis, alkalosis. Not to shift you. I do agree that those are excellent things to talk about. They are actually extraordinarily important to you as a medical provider. So much so that there's going to be an entire chapter about acid-base balances. So not that I'm not going to answer them today, but wait for bigger things. They are coming, I promise. And we're going to talk a lot about acid base, not only in that chapter, but whenever you get to medic school with me as well. That's much like ATP going to be one of the things that keeps haunting you is what happens, how do we handle metabolic versus respiratory acidosis and alkalosis, and kind of what are the implications of that within the body. You will see them come up. They're going to come up in the acid base chapter. They're going to come up whenever we talk about the renal chapter in this book, and then they're also going to come up again in the respiratory chapter. So that is a not today ... bigger things are coming, and if we talk about it right now, it's going to get further ahead than we may currently be, if that makes sense. I just don't want to muddy the water. The waters are already going to get muddy. It's going to look like we're out wading in the pluff mud at not quite low tide, where it's just stirring everything up. I don't want to do that quite yet. The last question is from Mr. Liam. So looking at intermolecular attractions, typically you think of ionic bonds as solid and covalent bonds as more gases and liquids, and wanted to know if there were any ionic bonds that were gases and liquids too. I'm so sorry, Jacob, to call you out again. I'm going to say that the ionic bonds can be dissolved in liquids, from my understanding and what I know of chemistry. So like, think about sodium hydroxide, so lye. Typically you can find that in like a powder, but it is dissolved, so you can find it in a solution as well. So it can be dissolved, but that doesn't necessarily make that bond itself as a liquid. But to think of bonds as liquids is kind of a weird brain exercise to begin with. Jacob, thoughts? Experiences?
Yeah, and I don't recall this question specifically. What exactly was the question? I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. So it's when it comes to intermolecular attractions, typically the ionic bonds are bonds that are quote unquote solid, and your covalent bonds are typically gases / liquids other than network solids. So are there any ionic bonds that are also liquids / gases too?
I can see where that understanding comes from. Generally, yeah, when you think of an ionic bond, you think of something like a salt, a calcium, or something with some sort of polyion, like a calcium hydroxide or some sort of sodium chloride. Any sort of salt you can imagine. Them being liquid at room temperature that's not completely incorrect. I can't really think off the top of my head something you would consider ionically bonded as being liquid at room temperature. One thing that we talk a lot about covalent bonding and understanding how we share electrons and all that type of stuff, and that sort of does a disservice to really what an ionic bond is, because we kind of, the general way we kind of go through chemistry education is to touch on general chemistry, then move into organic, but you don't necessarily go into organic a lot. So it is not entirely incorrect to say they mostly tend to be crystals. Where one thing to really point out with that question, though, is that covalent bonds tend to be gases or liquids. That is a misunderstanding. There are enormous numbers of covalently bonded things that are solids at room temperature. Sugar, right? I mean, sugar is solid at room temperature. That's a completely covalently bonded thing. Most of the stuff that we're probably discussing here in this class are all covalently bonded molecules that make you up, and you're a solid being in a lot of ways. So, yeah, I definitely wouldn't operate under the apprehension that covalent bonding equals gas or liquid, and ionic bonding is only solid. And I mean, you can melt salt, right? It takes a lot of energy, but you can melt salt and you can turn it into a liquid. So again, it's not like it can't be. It's just generally at room temperature, and it's mostly due to the mass of the species in question that it will be solid. But it's not like it has to be because of the nature of that bond itself. And then by the same token, covalently bonded stuff can most certainly be solid at room temperature. There's so many things you can think of that are like that.
The same with metals. We can melt metals. So that's why that one.
Right. Yeah. And metals. Metallic. Right. And metallic bonding is sort of its own thing, right? Because the way metals bond together is they in a pure sense, they bond together and they form this crystal where they all share what is usually described as a sea of electrons. They're almost like super covalently bonded in a way, though that's not usually the way you would teach that or explain that. But this is actually what I do. I actually I run a metals lab specifically, and there's a whole lot to talk about with that. But certainly I wouldn't think that to say covalently bonded stuff should only be gas or liquid.
Thank you for that. Looking at the chat, and kind of seeing what's going on. I like that you guys are sharing things. I'm going to let you guys keep kind of typing that. So going back over the quizzes, remember, before I jump into that, any questions about the things that we've talked about today? Or questions that came up while we were talking today? I like this question. Not to upset people here. There are certain things that are going to come up in this class that are important, but knowing the nitty gritty, and you'll hear that come up in some of the lectures where I mention like, do not get bogged down in the material itself, and you need to know it to like make it through the quizzes, but things that aren't extraordinarily important for you moving forward aren't going to be the things that are going to come up on like your midterm and your final and then in medic school. Chemistry is kind of one of those. So it is important to understand chemistry. It is important to understand kind of the big concepts of chemistry. Understanding functionally how bonds work. Knowing all of the nitty gritties. Knowing like each individual thing is less important. Knowing cations versus ions is going to be one of those things that's important. So like, don't spend your whole time like spinning your wheels, and this is where the one area where the quizzes maybe hurt a little more than help, because I don't edit the question bank. So like, I don't take them out of there. So you're going to see them on your quizzes. That's also why the quizzes, you can take them as many times as you need to, so that you can get the grade, you can get the studying. The chemistry chapter very much is one of those. Knowing broad strokes is going to be what's important moving forward. Knowing each individual thing that's within that chapter is a little less pertinent. With the quizzes, I like what everybody was mentioning. So again, you can take those as many times as you'd like. They are going to be open until ... So you can continue to use them to study. This is our first time in Canvas, so if they're not set to close. They're set to have like a due date where it shows you that, but they should still stay open. If they don't, let me know. For those quizzes, keep taking them as long as you would like to study. Talking about like, how are you approaching the quizzes? You can approach them in a couple different ways. So you can either read the ever loving snot out of your textbook and then just have to go take that quiz one time, or you can take the quiz, see where your holes in knowledge are, and then go back and brush up on those throughout the text and kind of use that as a study aid versus reading the entire textbook for days on end. Good question. The lectures. Honestly, because the lectures, they either don't cover everything within the chapter, or it mentions in there what's the important stuff to move forward. One of the big examples that like I know will be coming up is the Krebs cycle and the formation of ATP. That is an incredibly complex series of events. I don't expect you to memorize every single step of the Krebs cycle. I expect you to remember big events within the Krebs cycle, what is going in and what your goals are. In the lecture, I'm going to talk about that. And I'm going to tell you at the end, like, hey, here's what you actually need to, like, take with you moving forward. Organic chem is honestly the death of me and how I ended up being a paramedic and not going on to medical school. Straight up. And when you're looking at these things and when you're studying, in general, pathophysiology, your physiology of the body is going to be more important than the anatomy. Not to discount the anatomy, but knowing how muscles work is more important than being able to name every individual muscle in the body. Harkening back to like our conversation about regions versus quadrants, it will knowing all of those make you like a jam up clinician that you can name the muscle that they have an injury within? Sure. Is it going to change your overall treatment? Not especially. It should be, and it'll be on this video as you're watching it. You'll see the chat like in the recorded video. But let me see if there's a way I can like download it. Oh, I can. Save. I can save this entire chat as like a text file. I will upload it with the recording video into the classroom. So that way you don't have to watch the video again on like the YouTube link to look at it. You can just read it. Yeah. And as you guys were talking back and forth, is having another like discussion thread that's not necessarily your questions for the week, but just stuff you guys want to share with each other or questions you have for each other outside of the weekly chat, something you would be interested in. Done. I will get it set up as soon as we log off. Other questions, guys? Did you like this format? This is the first one you guys have had like this. Is there something else different I can do during these weekly meetings that would make it more beneficial for you? I find that you guys like this a little bit better than just being like lectured at. Having it be your questions that are answered and a dialogue back and forth. Good. I know we didn't make it to two, but honestly, we probably won't most weeks. Just because that's a long time to listen to. If we're having great discussion, we can go all the way to whenever. But if there's no other questions or things you guys want to talk about, I am done holding you hostage. Thank you for joining me. The recording of this, if you want to go back and listen to it at any point for review, and the download of the chat from this will be uploaded in the classroom. Give me like 10 minutes. And it'll be there. I'm glad you're enjoying it. This is how Medic's going to be set up as well, except you'll also be seeing me once a week in the lab.
Thanks, Megan.
Of course. You guys have a great day.